The purpose of this video is really just to dive into my processes, the way that I go upon my craft, specifically as a movement and skill acquisition specialist, how I view my role to be more of a problem setter and ultimately a facilitator of one's movement skill on an American football field. So obviously this is going to differ just a bit depending on what hat somebody might wear within an NFL organization, but I think I want to bring some light to that, which what I do within my process, because it'll begin to help connect the dots on some of the other things I might say within the other videos or the presentation. So again, when we think about my process as a skill acquisition specialist, it's really to assess the learning environment that the player is going to be placed under, so they have a learning environment that speaks to them with the movement problems that they are about to face. Remember, it's about chasing dexterity, trying to find and allow the athlete to express dexterity. Again, the ability to solve any emerging movement problem in any situation and in any condition. So for me, with that kind of as my North Star, if you will, within my craft, it helps me begin to use this four-step process, which is obviously kind of more of a 30,000-foot view as to what I do and how I do it. But I kind of just wanted to take us step by step so we're able to maybe come to a common ground there and connect the dots on on some of the other things that I might say, again, both within presentation or video. First and foremost, I always, because of my ecologically minded lens, will investigate and analyze movement behavior in context. Remember, context shapes content. The two flow into one another in this tight, circular, reciprocal way. So very rarely am I truly analyzing movement in the traditional sense in a reductionist or isolated fashion. I'm not trying to remove the athlete from the context whenever and however possible. I'm trying to keep them immersed in the slices or snippets of the game. So, because of that, for most of the players that I partner with, it just involves me diving into their film. And it might not just be uh, over the short term, and that might not just be this respective season. In fact, the more evidence that I can have there to get a glimpse as to how they're solving movement problems across situations and conditions, how they're facing these emerging movement problems in various contextual scenarios and situations, the more informed I'm going to be as to where their gaps might exist. Remember, from my perspective, the movement behavior that emerges in sport is about a problem solving activity. And these problem solving activities are composed of and underpinned by the intertwined, interwoven processes of perceptions, cognitions, and actions. So when I'm assessing movement behavior, it isn't just about the actions. Movement behavior to me is this more holistic, integrated process of perceptions, cognitions, and actions flowing into one another with tight circular causality. And so I'm attempting to analyze and assess that and determine their gaps, not only actions, not only the movement strategies, if you will, and how they execute or carry out those strategies, but more so the decisions that they're making and what's leading to those decisions, the perceptual pickup of the information within the world, what they might be looking at, when they might be looking at it, how else they could organize those perceptual degrees of freedom, just as they would with their action degrees of freedom. Again, from my perspective, perception leads to action and action flows back into perception. We perceive to act, we act to perceive. But those processes are also scaffolded by our cognitive processes. The decisions we make, our intentional aims to act in a given way, our thoughts that we're going to think. And it's up to me, if I am a skill acquisition specialist, to assist the athlete in that movement problem solving process. So I need to look at it across situations and across conditions. Slight changes to the nuances of the problems. Again, remember, across situations and conditions, if I'm looking at, say, maybe an NFL running back, between the tackles and in traffic within and between the tackles, of course, in tight space with somebody up in someone's lap or the running back's lap, or gaps to the left and to the right of that person, the information about opponents that are lying beyond that immediate local movement problem or that immediate opponent. And then, of course, when we talk about off tackle or outside of the tackles, and then near the numbers or in space, like these are all situations that I'm going to be looking at the nuances of their movement problem solving process. We might find that a player is very adept and equipped at being able to solve problems in that tighter space or in traffic. But then they get outside in a different context. Context changes slightly, still the context of the problem and solver coming together on an American football field. However, when the contextual scenario changes, the circumstances change, we might find that their movement problem solving process also changes. So that's something that I'm doing both subjectively as I'm looking at things through my art and through my lens, but also objectively. I might be using NFL Next Generation stats, or for you guys with Zebra Technologies, and really looking at uh, some of the interpersonal distances, some of the relative velocity values, not just the velocity of the player that is in question, but the velocity of him versus and in relation to another, bearing angles that might be changing, and how those angles in the informational pickup about it could determine how that player might move. Again, kind of corresponding to that interpersonal distance, because obviously the problem and solver are both constantly relating to one another, so they have changing states of organization. Hopefully that makes some sense. And then also we could look to gaps to the left and to the right that could be highly informative, highly inviting for the player. And I'm trying to determine, is that player connected to these information sources in utilizing that information to guide and channel their action? Because it's there, guys and gals, that I will then be able to determine the player's movement and skill execution gaps. These things represent the opportunities for the player to evolve their skill set. I'm trying to meet them where they are, but in order to do that, I have to analyze and assess how they're currently solving those problems. And of course, actions, the motor action degrees of freedom, the coordination and control of those respective strategies, and what we actually see as the expression of perception and cognition. Again, it's all interwoven. I am assessing that too. Biomechanics from a base of support, center of gravity changes, stances, positional strategies, patterns, and execution. But again, it's not done in isolation and away from the problem. And I think this is the biggest thing that most within the NFL, I would venture the guess and take no offense to this, no one in the NFL is really looking at it in this highly coupled reciprocal way. They are typically analyzing and assessing biomechanics of the mover themselves by themselves. Again, remember, like Bruce Lee would say, it's like a finger pointing the way to the moon. Don't concentrate on the finger. You focus on all that which what the finger is pointing at and why the finger might be pointing in that direction in the first place. So from here, I will then be able to determine how they're sort of coordinating, controlling, and organizing an integrated movement solution that is fit to the problems that they might face based on their position, their level of skill, what it is that we might want them to do as coaches. So this is where all of these things kind of come together for my process as a skill acquisition specialist. And it's why I beat the drum over and over and over again and have for a decade plus, that every NFL organization, from my perspective, needs to have a skill acquisition specialist on staff. Now, thirdly, here, once we've kind of taken those two steps, and again, some subjective, some objective, some qualitative, and some quantitative, I'm then going to attempt to design more alive practice activities, which I believe will adequately stretch that individual player to their challenge point. So no two problems are ever the same, as I often talk about. Neither are any two solutions. But what I will attempt to do is create slices or snippets of the game by constraining to afford. I'm manipulating constraints of the environment, task, and player themselves in some of their processes based on those things coming together. These alive movement problems, just to give you that reminder, they are indeterminate, they are unpredictable, they are dynamic, they are alive, right? It's always moving, the problem and the solver. Again, as I always say, if the practice drill or activity already has a prescribed end and start point or where people are going to go throughout, this is why I believe that traditional cone drills, change of direction drills, have very little efficacy when we're talking about elite National Football League players, because the problem doesn't look, feel, act, and behave like it will when they're on an NFL Sunday football field. And this, for me, I'm trying to make those problems look, feel, act, and unfold more like they will, but also to stretch that player, to let them fall off the bike a bit, to give them curvier roads to interact with. And it's there that I'm able to hopefully allow them to explore and search the movement problem, as well as their movement toolbox or movement catalog, to find the strategies and how to connect the dots between the opportunities and the problem so they can find more effective functional movement solutions to fit or match that problem. And this is what I feel like it means to create a learning environment that is conducive to channeling and facilitating more authentic and adaptable interactions for players. More specifically, more adaptable movement problem solving processes or experiences for players. I feel like most in American football haven't even gotten anywhere close to doing that, which what they could do in their learning and practice environment, because it's not actually a practice environment that's ripe for learning. Instead, it's a practice environment that's ripe for rote repetition or ripe for carrying something out in the way that the coach, as the guide from the side, is telling the player how to act or behave. But we want to give the player ownership. We want to allow them to have authenticity. We want to allow them to be adaptable and adjustable themselves. So ultimately, they themselves are the agent of their own movement problem solving processes. This, to me, remember, guys and gals, is about learning. It's allowing the athlete to have the learning exposure, the learning experience. And because of that, most of my guidance and communication, most of my cueing and feedback, or most of my instruction is oriented around nudging the player to explore both the environment as well as their own movement toolbox. I don't want to necessarily tell them exactly how it is that I feel that they should be moving, but I want them to find that for themselves. It doesn't mean that I don't speak. It doesn't mean that a coach shouldn't talk. But what it does mean is we have to be very careful and very cognizant to add value in this way so it gives embodiment and exposure to the athlete for them to go through their movement problem solving process. Remember, as Bernstein would say, it's not in repeating the means of a solution where practice activities can be effective, but instead it's in the process of repeating the process of solving that problem. It's in learn to move, or learning to learn to problem solve through one's movement, at least for me. And this is the same that I do it with an NFL player. Yes, they will have very established or stabilized ways of acting or interacting with most movement problems. That's intuitively obvious. They're one of 1,696, right? But it doesn't mean that the player doesn't have gaps, doesn't have opportunities, that they can explore those movement problems, particularly as their action capabilities might be changing, right? They might be getting a little longer in the tooth, and they can still be able to solve problems in a highly functional or effective fashion. It's mostly because they are becoming more attuned, intentional, and adaptable. Attuned meaning sensitive to the specifying information that tells us about the opportunities in those movement problems that one would connect to. Intentional, being open and responsive to being able to adjust one's aims to interact with that problem in different ways depending on what the problem is offering. And then ultimately adaptable. They're not locked into one way of acting or interacting with that problem, but instead they have a wide plethora of ways of solving that problem. Ultimately, they have abundance within their movement system at a perceptual, cognitive, and action level, so they are more adaptable to what the problem may dictate. That problem that's very alive, very dynamic, very chaotic, very complex. So I wanted to kind of bring everyone into my own particular process. And of course, there's a bunch of details that kind of fit within there, and I began to go down that rabbit hole a bit. So if you have questions, thoughts, concerns, you want more clarity on any one of those respective steps, by all means, feel free to let me know. I'm more than happy to interact around it.